In historic preservation circles, you often hear the term eyesore. Take a look at this building, for instance. What do you see here? Would you call this building a dump? Would you say that this building needs to be torn down and something new needs to be put in its place? Well, if you have that attitude, you would rob a community of one of its most beloved historic buildings. The Alvah Kittredge House was built in 1836 and saw many changes over its lifetime. After years of neglect, the property was thoughtfully restored by Historic Boston Incorporated. Renovations were complete in 2014, and today, the building is a showpiece. It now takes its place among a neighborhood filled with historic properties in the Roxbury section of Boston. The Alvah Kittredge Park row houses were built in the 1870s, and unfortunately time was not too kind to them either. But Historic Boston Incorporated rose to the challenge, and these buildings were also renovated. The Cox building was constructed in 1870. By the 1960s, the property was really falling apart. Thankfully, Historic Boston Incorporated stepped in, and the building was renovated by 1984. Today, the people of Roxbury enjoy this structure as a beautifully preserved landmark. I wanted to know more about this organization and its approach when dealing with historic buildings. Why is it when others see eyesore and no hope for restoration, they see the hidden beauty and a way to preserve these rare structures? So on this edition of No Country for Old Buildings, we have a special guest. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Kathy Kottaridis from Historic Boston.
Okay, so I guess in Beverly, what we've been seeing is the developer who owns a couple of historic sites says that preserving the buildings are economically unfeasible. Now, why is it Historic Boston can do things that developers, typically for profit, can't do?
Right. Historic Boston works with market forces like any other developer. We are a nonprofit developer, but we also rely very much on using our nonprofit status to raise money and to also take the time and use our long-term view to be a patient investor in our projects. So we don't need to flip properties, and we're not interested in that, although we do aim to revolve our projects. And what that means is that we make our investments, we get through whatever compliance period we need to, and get to a point where we're comfortable to sell, and then we do sell to a willing buyer so that we can revolve our investment into other projects.
It's been said that wood buildings are much harder to restore than brick buildings. This is a beautiful example of a wood building here that you guys have restored.
Sure.
It was a mess. We can show you some pictures later of this thing really falling apart.
Right.
But you guys figured out a way to do this. Could you speak about preserving wood buildings versus brick?
Well, the condition is the ultimate issue on brick or wood. So while wood, obviously, if it's deteriorated, needs a substantial amount of replacement, not just reconstruction like brick, it really is about the condition that you discover. And on this property, the Alvah Kittredge House, which is very important to this neighborhood and very important from an architectural standpoint, so it was worth really making the investments that we needed to make. But in order to do this, we had to replace about 40% of the structure here. Not just the exterior of what you see. Yes, the columns are new for the most part, although they are wood and they were done in the traditional manner. But the reality is that once we got into the house, the first thing we did was pull all the plaster away on the inside and look at the structure to evaluate whether or not we could keep that. This building had been exposed to the elements. There had been fires here and water damage and things like that, so it was very difficult to see what was going on in the back of the behind the plaster. But at the end of the day, it was worth replacing because it was we knew we could achieve a feasible project by making those adjustments. We could ultimately create 2-bedroom units in here that could be rented for the tax credit compliance period, which is about 5 years for using historic tax credits, and here we are today.
It's funny because I know you mentioned at one point the facade of this building was actually falling into the street. Or part of it.
The concern was this portico here because at least one of the columns, 2 of the columns were gone. One was sitting in the foyer in pieces, and I don't think we knew where the other one was. So we had to bring in scaffolding to prop it up, which are essentially braces to keep the portico from not falling down, because as you can see, we're right on the sidewalk, and it was considered a hazard for passersby and not a happy thing. Although that was one of the arguments for the city intervening and playing a role in transferring this property to us, was that the concern was that it wasn't just that we were losing our heritage and losing our history, but that the blight of this building was a danger to the people living around it and passing by it.
How far gone does a building have to be for your organization to say, I don't think it can be saved? I mean, I'm assuming with this building, the history of it and the importance of it sort of pushed you towards saving it. I mean, what's the worst you've ever seen that's been brought back?
Like any developer, it's a bunch of different things all wound up together in a particular alchemy that you gotta hope you can get at, which is that sometimes you need to wait until the incentives are all in the right place, or that the building is available, or the property's available, or not. That the market's pretty good for residential, which here it was not when we were planning it, but by the time the project was done, the rental rates for apartments were pretty high. So we were in a good place, and we felt much better and much more comfortable upon completion. But you don't always know that, and you don't know when you're going to know when those things will actually settle out into some point of clarity. And this building was under someone else's control for a very long time, and property rights matter. So we had to try to work with those owners, and that didn't work out after a long period of time. So we did our best advocacy behind the scenes to really bring the building to the attention of city leadership, to basically say, are we going to lose this, and are we also going to have a hazard because we just can't seem to push it along or help the current owner do something, or find someone else to do it, or that you won't intervene and help us to get it. So at the end of the day, these are all moving pieces. You don't know when they're going to align into the perfect place. We obviously are a developer of last resort. We're a nonprofit. We aim to save properties like this. If there's a private owner or developer who could have done this, we would step aside and ask how we can help. But we would not fight with anyone to be able to be the first in line to do it. So I think the real answer to your question is we need to be in a position as an organization that we have time and energy to devote to a difficult project. We have a whole pipeline of them, so that has to be in good order. And then we need to see a way out. We need to see that we can do the project, we can get the money for development, and we can line up all those resources, but that we can also exit if we have to, or if the property if we discover something that can't be fixed, or if we find that this is really a property that this is a replacement scenario as opposed to a restoration, we need to have the courage to call it. And that is something that we will, I can tell you, we have those conversations when we're planning projects like this. We'll go pretty far, 40% structural replacement here, lots and lots of cosmetic replacement here. But we will also pretty much call it if we see that it's too far gone, and that a nonprofit like ours will lose its shirt, that we can't continue to keep doing important work because we won't give up. So I think that's a hard message to absorb, and I will tell you 9 times out of 10 we get in there and we do the job and we get it done. And it's all a question of timing and when. But we always have to be ready to make the realistic assessment of the project.
Now, I was looking at the firehouse project in Dudley Square. That building, I think you said it was propped up. It was in such bad condition, you had to engineer some sort of frame to prop it up.
Right. Yes.
Looking at that, through layman's eyes, I would say, there's no way you can save a building like this, but you guys managed to do that.
Well, let's add other variables to these situations. This building had a lot of advocacy around it. A lot of the neighbors here who have been improving their homes and making investments and hoping that those ultimately are valuable to their own futures have been looking at this building and thinking, oh my God, when will somebody take care of that? And yet no one ever advocated for it to be taken down. Many of them were really at the front end of advocating for its restoration. They wanted to keep it. They could recognize the architectural value and they saw it as being emblematic of the neighborhood. So we listened hard to those kinds of voices, and we also believe strongly that you need to have community voices speaking up for the projects. I mean, if nobody's asking for something to be attended to, it's true, you do have to pause and say, is it really that meaningful? But that said, the firehouse, same thing. It was falling over, visibly falling over. HBI designed a buttress system with our structural engineers, and ultimately the city of Boston, which owned the property, adopted that and installed it. And it sat there for 17 years. It was intended to be a 2-year solution, and it ended up being there for 17 years. Wow. Until we went back again, finally in the late 2000s, 2008, we were designated to develop it by the city on a long-term lease. So the city ultimately did not want to put it out for ownership. They put it out for a 100-year lease, 99 years. And we took all responsibility for it and were able to get at it again. And the question really at that point is, why, your question, the community was really, really hell-bent on saving that property. It's the oldest firehouse in the city. They felt that it was important to the Dudley Square business district, that it was one of the oldest buildings in that neighborhood. In fact, I would argue it actually is the oldest building, 1859. And that it was one of the few remaining elements of a historic district, and that it was worthy of preservation. So we'll leave it at the fact that the community made their best pitch for it and stood by it, and we were listening. But I think by 2008, there were state historic tax credits in place that were not there before. The New Markets Tax Credit Program from the federal government, from the U.S. Treasury Department, was also in place, and we used those resources.
What are those?
Those are meant for low-income census tracts of urban or rural nature, it doesn't matter, that where the investment, which can be as valuable as 39% tax credit to the investor in a New Markets Tax Credit Program, it would be eligible because it was creating jobs or it was some form of economic development. And in this case, we were going to move 2 businesses, ourselves included, out to Dudley Square from downtown Boston. And we were going to save and restore and reactivate really a building whose square footage we were also going to double by putting an addition on the back of it. So the tax credit was a really valuable resource that wasn't there when we put those buttresses up 17 years before. So we were really in a different place to take a different look at that building. And we were able to really work it out. And the city was very helpful, just to add to that stack of sources in a development scenario, which community development projects often have. The city gave us a very low interest loan to help us get this done. Don't forget, and this is one of the problems of all real estate development, historic or otherwise, markets go up and down. And in 2008, when we were designated, the early part of the year, all was well, and we were cautiously conservative, but we felt like we could get this done. By the fall of 2008, the bottom had fallen out in the broader markets. We had no tenants. We had no easy way of identifying retail tenants for that site. And the financial markets were messy. It wasn't obvious that we were going to get a bank loan. So we had to think differently and pull all of our partners and friends together. And yes, by 2010, when we broke ground, we had everything in place after many headaches, many headaches.
I can imagine.
And many sleepless nights, but we found it and figured it out. And one of the solutions was that Historic Boston, as a company, as a nonprofit company, would move out to Roxbury and occupy a portion of that firehouse. So here we are. I mean, we're now part of the neighborhood, which is terrific. We're closer to the projects that we serve and the projects that we do and the neighborhoods we serve, but we also made our project feasible because we took on 50% of the tenancy in that property, and the other half was taken on by a foundation that was interested in moving to Roxbury as well. So we did not know all of these things when we went back and revisited this project 17 years later. Certainly in that 17-year period, no one else was willing to stick their necks out to address a property of that level of distress. So I think it's a matter of the nonprofit of Historic Boston figuring out how it can possibly cobble together every imaginable source and make sure that preservationists are playing their role, meaning the Landmarks Commission and local preservationists, historical societies are playing their role in advocating and being vigilant and being thoughtful about what the reuses could be, because the reality is we are, and let me be very clear, Historic Boston doesn't build museums, we don't create museums, we don't finance museums, or we'll do a performing arts space for an existing organization that has a proven track record, but we don't restore property for some hoped for use because people think it should be a historic museum. Mm-hmm. We want these properties to be back in use for market reasons and that can be supported by market uses, because then they will be sustainable and supportable and maintainable over time.
So basically, I gather the argument against preservation is there's a free market, mm-hmm. mind your own business, and yet in Beverly we have master plans that say we should set aside funds for preservation. Yep. We have the CPA, which the majority of the people in Beverly voted for. What are your thoughts on what cities can do to save these buildings? Because some people say, well, we have a historic commission and all they do is a demolition delay for a year and that's it, our hands are tied.
So I personally have spent a lot of time in municipal government. So I'm very aware of both the front-end planning, community desires, and all of those kinds of things, but also that property owners and other segments of the community are looking for economic development. They're looking to expand the tax base. So I totally understand that, and I think we have to have a healthy respect for economic development because it's what keeps our cities and towns healthy in Massachusetts. But I think practically speaking, in the preservation world, while designations and inventories and identification and education is critical. I mean, that's how you build an argument for a place to be maintained and why this mansard property should be maintained, but that one, all right, we don't need to, we don't fall on a sword for that one. That you can weigh things in a certain way. But I think what's missing often in the preservation world are organizations like Historic Boston, and I don't mean to do an advertisement. I actually really
feel free.
I will proselytize on this because I think it's important for those of us who care about historic buildings to like roll up our sleeves and get into the mishigas of development. And it's not something that preservationists do universally. We spend much more time if we're weighing things on education and designations and restrictions and all of the things that are, believe me, very important. We have them and we do them, but we also pull out the calculators and we go talk to financing sources and we figure out what the market rents are in a neighborhood and we start putting a deal together. And the deal making is the thing. I mean, I'm not always sure that preservationists go so far as to make the argument in true blue numbers or show the dimensions of the problem, which is okay. I mean, that's what we typically do because we're the developer of last resort. We show the dimensions of the gap or the problem between the sources to pay for redevelopment of a beautiful historic building and the actual construction costs. And usually there's a huge gap and we have to figure out how to adjust the project, add on, do something that are a series of weighted options.
Now that's an interesting question. How do you bridge the gaps? Mm-hmm. Because I think in Beverly, one of the projects, guy said it was millions of dollars, the gap. Do you typically bridge gaps of millions of dollars.
We have.
What are
I
the
won't tell you
tools?
that we would do that on every project.
What are some of the tools you used?
We, as a nonprofit, raise money, and let's also be realistic. If I were speaking to a group of preservationists interested in keeping a place, I'd ask how much money you'd be willing to raise charitably. Now, I'm not just saying put your money where your mouth is. That's not right. It is much more about how valuable is a property like this one. This one required us to raise somewhere between $1.3 and $1.4 million outright charitable funding that went into the project, and no one will ever see a return on that money. Let's just be clear. But we knew what we were doing and why we were doing it, because nobody wanted to lose this. Everyone wanted to see it restored, and the value of that charitable money was in those elements, the creation of housing, the social benefits of creation of housing, the social benefit of restoring an emblematic piece of local history, the unusual Greek Revival building that this is. We have like 2 of these in the city, I think. I mean, this kind of frame building. So you have to put almost a price tag on what the social value of restoring or raising money to restore a place actually is. And it's not always, I mean, that will force you to really do a serious evaluation. It kind of goes back to how do you pick and choose. We often ask, do we really think that that was more money than Historic Boston has ever raised for a historic building, ever? And yet we thought to ourselves, it's possible. And we're scared to do it. We got to get out there and do it, but we did. And now we feel a lot better about making arguments like that in other places where there are needs like that. And we're now on to another one in Mattapan, which is a neighborhood with very weak markets, very weak, but a wonderful property with a house and a barn and land and an opportunity for urban farming, which that neighborhood deeply desires. And we're on to our next $1 million gap.
That's the Clark Fowler Farm.
Yes.
For those of you who don't know, it's one of the last remaining farmhouses in Mattapan. It was owned by the same family, the Epstein family, for a long time. Eventually, through much wrangling and misadventures and adventures, you got your hands on the property and are going to fix it up. I look at that as an example of, in Beverly, the politicians would say, well, saving a farmhouse would cost us a new police station because we could have big development here.
Right.
And that seems to be the mindset in the suburbs. Here in the big city, you get these big ideas that bubble up.
So
in the suburbs, I think...
we had the same thoughts on the Clark farm. Just want to make you aware of this, that it is 30,000 square feet, and maybe the buildings cover, I don't know, maybe about 3,000 square feet. A lot of land around it, and we thought to ourselves, various scenarios. Could we build in between and around buildings and benefit from affordable housing funds that are out there and increase the number of units that are available in this neighborhood? Could we build, could we sell off a portion of the land and have someone else be able to develop a 3-decker or a 6-family or something like that? And we went through, this is going to go back to the financial analyses that I believe are very important for us to do when we make these arguments. We did the analyses and discovered that it would be less feasible to do that than to simply restore a house and a barn and activate the landscape. And let me tell you, one of the things that I think is hard in development is that you have to work super hard to go out and find the people who are going to work with you on these projects. And that it's time for a developer, and I totally understand that. That's time for them to beat every door and find a green space group that's willing to grow, land or grow the land and, those kinds of things. So it is a matter of, I don't have a simple answer to that except to say that you could look at the entire scenario, and I'm not sure that the private interests always look at the other end of the spectrum, so that we can meet in the middle somewhere. The idea that you can preserve a historic building perhaps on a site, maybe you could move it. Maybe you can make it available to a group of people who are interested in restoring it by moving it up against the road and then building your 3 or 4 story apartment building behind it. And frankly, have most private interests thought hard about what a restored building in fact, would do for the identity of the marketing identity of their particular project. Developers are always looking at the bottom line, and I completely understand that. But sometimes there's good reason to think about holding on to pieces of this and being creative. Good reason. And finding partners who will take it on. And we've seen all of those work in different scenarios. But if you don't have, I actually think it would be very helpful to have a nonprofit partner like Historic Boston working on sites like that, making the counter arguments or confirming that that is in fact perhaps true, sorry to say.
Yeah.
But, without the information, these are planning exercises, they're not actual development exercises.
Often when you restore a building, especially if you're getting historic tax credits, you have to follow standards, which means you have to put in the historically correct windows, historically correct materials. Sometimes I look at the standards and I say it's actually hurting historic buildings because developers will weigh all the expense of the standards versus just tearing things down and putting in new construction. They don't seem to be allowed to take a building that's falling apart and maybe using more inexpensive material. What do you think about the standards?
They can be very high. Everybody loves the outcome when everything's done, but the fact is preservation tax credits are given to property owners and developers not because they're trying to give you a reward for having saved, for owning a historic building and giving you a cash benefit, meaning just for the sake of having a historic building. It's to help you do these things. So I think that we have still found a net benefit to our projects by utilizing historic tax credits and being required to use those. And we just kind of count on it when we're doing our projects. And there are times that our contractors in the middle of a project have been driven crazy by having to redo a cornice because the profile wasn't done the way that it was supposed to be done. But the reality is that in the end, everybody is just delighted by the quality of the work that we do. And I think if you talk to most developers worth their salt, they'll tell you that you factor it in your planning, and you recognize the net benefit from the tax credits that you're utilizing, state and or federal. I suppose there are times that it is so costly that on very, very distressed buildings, it only adds to the cost of rehabilitation and you can only cover, so much of that. My sense is that one needs to really evaluate whether the tax credit is the right incentive to be used and the value of that in relation to the financing of the project. It might be that it's best to just go to the bank, get a loan, or get a grant from the State Historical Commission to do something a certain way, but not necessarily at the highest end of the Secretary of Standards.
Are there any banks or any organizations that like historic buildings so much they will really make the financing good, like very low interest loans or even no interest loans, and maybe write it off?
Probably none. I can't tell you any off the top of my head, but my answer to that question would be what we do, because I'd love something like that. I mean, that would certainly be great for us too. What we really do is talk about our projects as economic development projects or as development projects. Yeah, we're preserving the history, sure, but we are in the end helping to contribute to some higher policy goals of the city. So, the firehouse in Dudley Square was part of the rejuvenation of Dudley Square. It was expanding office uses in Dudley Square, reversing blight. I mean, you just go down the list of things that the municipal governments frequently talk about and which communities talk about a lot, and pay attention to those, because it's not first about, for us, it's not first about preservation. It has to be in the end, but it's got to be about a project that can stand on its own 2 feet when it's done, and hence it's got to relate to some other benefits of the neighborhood.
We hope you've enjoyed part 1 of our interview with Kathy Kottaridis, the Executive Director of Historic Boston Incorporated. Join us again next time for part 2, where we'll take on a broad range of topics, from urban renewal to what Beverly might do to better preserve its historic structures. That's next time on No Country for Old Buildings. And yet in Beverly, we have master plans that say we should set aside funds for preservation. We have the CPA, which the majority of the people in Beverly voted for. I don't know what I don't know what this wind is going to do to the production, but
it's okay.
We'll cut this all out in editing.